Okay, this is going to be the first video for the Trig identities, verifications, proofs, all that kind of stuff. I want to bring it back to the concept of these identities that we started with, that sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. The derivations of that, if you were to isolate the different trig functions, the same thing for tan, okay? The same thing for cotangent, okay? What I also want to do is just go over a couple of algebraic sort of tricks to sort of understand, how we solve these kinds of things. The first thing I want to go over, something very simple. Understand that addition is commutative. Okay, now what does that mean? I mean, we talked about that when you're in Algebra 1. But sine squared of theta plus cosine squared of theta equals 1 is the same as cosine squared theta plus sine squared of theta equals 1. So that's something you want to keep in mind, is that sometimes if there's addition, it's okay if the terms are switched. That's something to look out for. The other thing is the second part is writing, okay, in terms of sine and cosine, okay? Now, this is a trick that will help you simplify, all right? Now, what do I mean by that? Well, we have these trig functions, secant, cosecant, tangent, and cotangent. These can all be written in the form of cosine and sine. For instance, secant is 1 over cosine, okay? And vice versa. Cosecant is 1 over sine. Tangent actually can be written as sine over cosine. And with that being said, cotangent can be written as cosine over sine. Okay? So that's something else that's going to be very valuable for you. All right? Okay? A couple of other things to keep in mind. Okay? Division of fractions. Make sure you flip the second fraction. The one on the right. Okay? All right, that's something else to keep in mind operationally, okay? Now, another algebra trick I want to show you, okay? An algebra trick, all right? If you have something like this, let's say x squared times y, well, it's not really like that. A couple algebra tricks. If you have x times y, or x squared times y, and you have xy, okay? Keep in mind that what this basically means is this, where you can eliminate those, all right? You're left with x. So that's a little trick, is sometimes you may need to separate those things out. Another algebra trick that I wanted to show you, all right? If you have a plus between those, you are allowed to write these like this, where this would be 1, okay? All right, so that's another algebra trick, is that you can separate those. We're going to go through some of these tricks, all right, are going to be needed, and these identities are going to be needed, all right, as we go through our various problems here, okay? All right, now let's take a look at our first couple of examples. Simplify, okay? Now, so what that means is I want to get it in the simplest form that I can. Now, like I said, one of the things you always might want to try to do is rewrite these things as sine and cosine, okay? So this would be 1 over sine, okay, times 1 over cosine, minus, well, how do we know that one? That's cosine over sine. Okay, so we've got that to start. Now, if I'm subtracting fractions, I would need a common denominator. So what is this side missing that this side has? Nothing, but this side's missing a cosine theta. So I would multiply by cosine theta on the top and the bottom, okay? So what I got here is I got 1 sine theta cosine theta minus cosine theta over sine theta and cosine theta. Now, once those are the same, I am now permitted to push together the top. Okay, now, I've got that so far. Okay, now if you look at your identity sheet, this should be the same. Anytime you see a squared, that should always be a dead giveaway to look for something. This is the equivalent of sine squared. Okay, so this is what I got. All right, now to simplify this further, this is what I have. Sine of theta times sine of theta times cosine of theta. All right, well what I can do, I can go ahead and cancel those two out, okay, because they're the same. So what do I have left? Sine of theta over cosine of theta, which that's going to equal tangent of theta. Okay, all right. So and this is going to take some practice, okay? This is going to take some practice, all right? Okay, so that's one. Let's do another one together, all right? So I got this, all right, secant, 1 over cosine. Cotangent would be cosine, whoops. Would be cosine over sine. This is just 1 minus sine. Okay, all right. Now, what sort of works out nice here, okay, from a fraction standpoint, I got multiplication of fractions going on. Remember, I'm allowed to eliminate things vertically. So I got 1 over sine of theta minus sine over theta and 1. Okay? All right? So I've been allowed to eliminate those. Okay? All right, because they're diagonal. That's another algebra trick. All right, so we can add that to our tricks as well that we can be able to do. Is that if you have, let's say, over, I don't know, 1. You're allowed to eliminate vertically, okay? All right, we'll put that in there. All right, now, I gotta get a common denominator. What is missing from this side? I'm missing a sine of theta, so I have to multiply that by the top and the bottom, okay? So what I got is 1 sine of theta minus sine squared of theta over sine, okay? Now, since they're the same, I can push those together. All right, now, that is one of the identities. This will be cosine squared over sine squared, over sine theta, okay? Now, here's what you can do with something like this, okay? All right, I am permitted, okay, to space this out, so cosine of theta and cosine of theta, all right? And I only got 1 sine of theta, all right? Okay, now, this part, I sort of know already. That is going to be cotangent of theta, and that next part would be cosine of theta. Boom. And that's how I'd get that answer, okay? All right. I would like you guys to try these 2 questions, okay? Practice it. It's going to take some repetition, and we'll go ahead and go over these together, okay? All right. So what I got here is 1 over sine of theta times 1 over cosine of theta minus sine of theta over cosine of theta. Okay, what's this side missing? I can't eliminate anything. What's the side missing that this one has? This one is missing a sine of theta and a sine of theta. Okay, so what I got is 1 sine of theta cosine of theta minus sine squared over, we'll just write it as the same order, does not matter. Okay, I'm allowed to push those together. Okay, Now, that is going to equal cosine. Okay? All right, cosine of theta, cosine squared. And this still is sine of theta, cosine of theta. All right? Now, let's go ahead and try to split that up. See how that goes. Let's see if I can get anything to eliminate. Okay? Well, these two are the same, boom. So I'm left with this. What does this equal? Cotangent of theta. That would be my answer. Okay? Let's do this problem. I got 1 over the sine of theta minus cosine of theta times cosine of theta over sine of theta. Okay, this one actually worked out pretty easy. Okay, so I got 1 over sine of theta minus cosine squared of theta over sine. All right, so this would end up being pretty easy for me because there's already a common denominator. I can push those together. All right, sine squared. Oh no, not sine, sorry, sine. All right, well, what does this equal? Sine squared. All right, what can I do with that? I can write that as sine of theta with a sine of theta here. So what happens? That goes away. Only thing left over, sine of theta. Okay? All right, so it's going to take some practice. It's definitely going to take some practice. Okay? Let's talk about these. Okay, so you already see something squared here. So see if you have an identity. Well, this identity, all right, actually matches up with cotangent squared. If you look at your identity sheet, okay, this one matches up with cosine squared. All right, now, when you have something like this, multiple things squared, and this one is not in the form of cosine, what I would do, go ahead and treat this thing a division sign of cotangent. This might make it easier. Well, what do we know that cotangent is? It's cosine squared over sine squared, okay? All right, what does division of fractions do? It flips this. So I got sine squared of theta over cosine squared of theta, and on this side I have cosine squared of theta, really over 1. Well, what I'm allowed to do is eliminate those, and so what's only left is sine squared. Okay? All right, let's look at this one. Okay? You see this identity? This identity is going to be sine squared. Okay? This identity here, secant squared minus 1 is tangent squared. All right, so once again, I got this. Now I'm going to write this like this. Okay? So we know that this is sine squared over cosine squared. This is just going to be sine squared. Flip that fraction, say cosine squared over sine squared times sine squared. I know that eliminates, and I'm left with cosine squared. All right, you put the theta at the end if you want. Okay? All right, go ahead and see if you guys can give this one a try. Okay? All right? Now, since this is already sitting there like that, okay, I'm not going to worry about this equaling tangent squared plus 1. Okay, so I can get rid of this part, all right? That is going to be, so I got secant squared, and this part would turn into cosecant squared. Okay, all right? Now, so what I want to do is write secant squared divided by cosecant squared. All right, so rewriting this is be 1 over cosine squared. Okay, all right, divided by 1 divided by sine squared. Okay. The division means that I'm going to flip that. Okay, now there's no quick elimination here. Okay, so this one would just be sine squared over cosine squared. Well, what do we know that's going to be? That's going to be tangent squared. Okay, all right, let's take a look at this one. Cosecant squared minus 1. Okay, I know that this part is equal to cotangent. So this is what I got so far. Okay, all right. So what am I going to do with this? Let's write this. Split the fraction up. Okay, rewrite this in terms of cosine and sine. Okay, so this would be When I flip this, would be cosine squared times sine squared over 1. Those eliminate. I'm left with cosine squared. Okay. All right. So just some algebra tricks. Just some algebra tricks. Okay. Now, I see something like this. This is difference of squares. Notice how this is a minus and this is a plus. This is the same thing. Think of it like this. The shortcut here, when you see this, I only got to multiply first and last. Okay? So that's the same thing. I multiply those, multiply those. That's cosine secant squared minus cotangent squared. Okay? Now, if you look down at your formula sheet, okay, you'll see this just equals 1. And that's it. Okay? So sometimes they can be that simple. Okay? So I'm just trying to show you a couple of different things. Okay? So this one, all right, try this one on your own. But this one would be 1 minus sine squared theta. What does this equal? Cosine squared. Boom. Done. Okay? All right? Sometimes they are that simple. Okay? Now, I want to finish off talking about, all right, what would you do with something like this, okay, with the force? Now, what I would do is I would write that as 1 plus cosine squared and 1 minus cosine squared, okay? Now, this, all right, has an identity. That is going to be sine squared, okay? Now, this one doesn't have an identity, but what I know is that cosine squared is equal to 1 minus sine squared, okay? So this will be one of those times I'm going to replace this stuff here. Okay, so I replace this with this. So if I combine that, that's 2 minus sine squared of x. All right, and then all I got to do is distribute it. That'd be 2 sine squared of x, negative sine to the 4th x. Okay, all right. Let's do one more of those. All right, let's do one more of those. All right, so I would do 1 plus sine squared, 1 minus sine squared. I know that this is a thing of cosine squared. I know this one's not perfect, but I know that this is going to be, I would put 1 minus cosine squared into here, okay? So once again, that combines to 2 minus cosine squared times cosine squared. So I would just distribute that. Okay, so 2 cosine squared minus cosine to the 4th. Okay, all right. So what I'd like you to do is finish off and do this one on your own. Okay, so I got 1 minus cosine squared, 1 plus cosine squared. Okay, now, all right. Should have done this one. Let's change this to this here. Change this to this. This would be cosecant squared plus 1, cosecant squared minus 1. Okay, our cosecant squared minus 1 would equal cotangent. Okay, all right, would equal cotangent. This part I do not have a great thing because it's not plus 1, but I have that cosecant of squared is equal to cotangent squared plus 1 with the extra plus 1. So I just substituted that for that. Okay, so that would be cotangent squared plus 2 times cotangent squared with x. So I just distribute that. That's going to be cotangent to the 4th plus 2 cotangent squared. Okay, all right. So that is an introduction to verification. We will practice a lot of these questions together.